Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're located here today. I'd like to thank you for joining the Harris Center's latest ForecastNL session on communities and infrastructure. I'm Rob Greenwood, Director of the Harris Center and EVP Public Engagement and External Relations for Memorial University. And first, I would like to do the land acknowledgement. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are located are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located this morning and to consider the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. Today's session looks closely at the impact climate change is having on communities and their infrastructure in Newfoundland and Labrador. What is the capacity of municipalities to take on the adaptation and preparation that is needed? Replacing and adapting infrastructure in our communities is and will continue to be paramount in the face of climate change. What is already underway? What are the latest approaches to planning and adaptation? What else needs to be done to prepare? We're going to pose some of these questions today to our three panelists who have a wealth of knowledge on these topics. After hearing from our panelists, we will set aside the second half of this session for your questions. So get ready. Feel free to post them in the Q&A box at any point during the session, and we will read them out depending on time, and Kathy will cluster questions together if there's a bunch on the same topic. And remember, we are recording today's session, which will be posted online afterward in our ForecastNL forum, harriscenterforum.ca/forecast-NL. And you can just go to the Harris Center website to find that. Please visit that website to view all of our past ForecastNL sessions and take part in the many active discussions taking place there. We have a pan-provincial citizens forum who are actively engaged throughout the process, along with anybody else who wants to join in. So now let's meet our panelists. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Joe Dario. Joe has been at Memorial since 2015 and is an associate professor in the Department of Civil Engineering. He earned his PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Iowa in 2009, received his bachelor's degree in Environmental and Forest Biology from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in 1991, and has master's degrees in Biology, 1994, Philosophy, 1998, and Environmental Engineering, 2002. And Joe can pretty much discuss any aspect of all this based on that. His primary interests include assessment of climate change impacts on natural and built infrastructure systems. His research is focused on developing new methods with which to incorporate climate change uncertainty into infrastructure design. Joe is joined by Dr. Kathleen Perwick. Kathleen is Municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador's Community Collaboration and Development Officer. Her own research has examined local scale climate change adaptation, and her day job is substantially addressed now to community infrastructure, supporting towns trying to manage their existing municipal assets while meeting new regulatory standards, anticipating climate change impacts, and in many cases, also coping with declining tax bases. MNL's longstanding advocacy on regionalization is founded on giving more communities the means to become more sustainable, especially where current infrastructure and services are falling short. And we are joined by longtime Harris Center collaborator and member of our advisory board, Dr. Kelly Vodden. Kelly is a professor with the Environmental Policy Institute and lead of the Rural Resilience Research Group at Memorial's Grenfell campus. Dr. Vodden has led a number of major research projects and has published widely on a range of topics related to sustainable community and regional development research, policy, and practice across Canada, particularly in Newfoundland and Labrador. She recently co-authored the Rural and Remote Communities chapter of the Canada in a Changing Climate National Issues Report, released by Natural Resources Canada in 2021. Welcome, panel. Thank you all so much for joining us, and looking forward to getting into this now. We'll start off with Kelly with a rather broad question. What are the concerns for communities in Newfoundland and Labrador based on your work when it comes to planning and adapting to climate change?
Thanks, Rob. I'll kick things off. I'm going to speak about a couple of different projects that actually Kathleen and I have both been involved in, so we'll lead nicely into Kathleen, I expect. One was 10 years ago now. We worked on something called the 7 Steps to Assess Climate Change Vulnerability in Your Community, which is a guidebook. There it is. Yes, I have my binder here too, for communities in Newfoundland and Labrador. And although it's 10 years old, I think it's still quite relevant. And we identified 5 key weather and climate related issues at that point. And the guidebook walks communities through how those issues might affect their community. So those included river and coastal flooding, erosion and slope movement, winter issues such as freeze-thaw cycles and impacts on roads from that, or disruptions to livelihood or recreational activities due to reduced snow and ice cover, and less dominant but also present drinking water and forest fire related concerns. So that's a bit of background there on some of the issues that we identified as important at that point. In the more recent national assessment on rural and remote communities and impacts of climate change, some of the key points there that I thought would be worth mentioning, and I know Brian Eddy and perhaps some of the other co-authors are on the line here from that work. First, that small rural and remote communities are disproportionately impacted by the changes that are occurring. And I think that is a concern for our province as a whole, because often their livelihoods in these communities are very much intertwined with their natural ecosystems, which are changing. Also reduced capacity, and that issue has already come up today in some of these communities, financial and human resources to deal with the kinds of changes that are being felt. And that's particularly acute in Arctic and subarctic regions where changes are occurring more rapidly. So I want to point that out. There's a large diversity in those rural and remote communities and how they're being impacted. But also we talk about the strengths in rural and remote communities and the assets that we can draw upon, such as our connections to each other and to place, and understanding of changes that are happening in place. So that's another important point. So it's not all doom and gloom, maybe. That there's certainly lots of challenges, but also strengths to build upon and assets that we can use. But certainly infrastructure is a key point in that national work, and I know we're going to talk more about that today. The risk of failure and disruption on infrastructure. And in rural and remote communities, you get situations like a single road access. And when those transportation or communication routes are really very vulnerable in the communities that rely on them when weather and climate change related events occur. A last point that I'll make for now is that livelihoods and economies. So I mentioned that close connection between rural and remote communities particularly and their natural environments. That often means that livelihoods are dependent on those ecosystems and resources, and those livelihoods are threatened by climate change. And the national assessment also has a regional impacts chapter, which I'll put in the chat in a minute. And that speaks to fisheries and tourism, for example, as 2 sectors that are really impacted by climate changes and that many of our communities depend on. So, and there's inflexibility, for example, in fisheries regulations and policies that don't necessarily take climate change into account. So those livelihood impacts, I think, are also significant challenges for our province. So leave it at that for now.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Joe, you have a slightly different perspective as an engineer. What do you see as the biggest challenges for communities in Newfoundland and Labrador as it relates to climate change?
Thanks, Rob. Well, I can say that Kelly already said it, but I'll explain more. Really, I think a lot of it comes down to financial resources and available resources, and you know, from the engineering perspective, let me say that engineers have developed and are developing ways to incorporate climate change into design through one such example is called the PIVC protocol. And there's also the climate lens that's used. That's really got to do with risk assessment and how risk assessment is done, and it incorporates climate change. And these methods have been advanced throughout the country. The problem with them, though, is that they require large teams, and they're really, you need money to afford that. And that's just not available. And so, unfortunately, the responsibility, if we can use that term, gets shifted to the municipalities to come up to use their finances as much as possible, when in reality they don't, the information is not there on how to do that. So there's a disconnect or a gap between what engineers are doing, which is great, but it's for bigger projects and for money, with folks with resources and money. And they're not coming down to meet the smaller communities and communities with that don't have the resources to engage that huge teams with all the information that dealing with climate change, projections, uncertainty, all these things that need to be accounted for when you're designing infrastructure. It's just the capacity is not there, and that's really, I think, the biggest challenge is this is, like I said, this gets forced on the municipalities. And from an engineering perspective, and a lot of the work I'm doing is trying to bring engineers to the municipalities but we also need to talk with municipal leaders, decision makers, so that they understand that in my view, that what they need to know, and that they can ask for things and demand things, that engineers do things instead of solutions being imposed. This is nobody's fault, right? It's just where we are. We just need to fix that. So there's a lot there to unpack, quite frankly. But in essence, I think that's the biggest challenge: is how can we, with small communities, without a whole lot of money, without a lot of resources, how can they engage the technical expertise regarding infrastructure in a way that accounts for climate change in a way that's forward-thinking, sustainable, and build resilience, instead of just one-off, put a big culvert in and then walk away and it's going to fail again, and then we're stuck with these bad situations. So yeah, I think that kind of outlines it in a nutshell.
Great. Thanks, Joe. Well, Kathleen, lots to talk about municipalities there, and you spend every day working with them on this across the province. How prepared are they, or aren't yet, to respond to these climate change challenges?
Well, I think there's a great deal of day-to-day coping that it's hard to really get a handle on, but in general, the things that we know are, as both Kelly and Joe have said, the capacity is not there to actually reach on some of these other areas of practice where the towns don't necessarily have, staff on board with expertise or time to spare to be able to use some of the tools that are available. M&L spends a great deal of time managing expectations, if you will, regarding municipal governments in this province. We have 275 of them, and fully 3/4 are representing populations of less than 1,000 people. Fully half of them are smaller than 500. That 3/4 number keeps cropping up. 3/4 of our towns only have one or fewer staff equivalent, in order to be able to handle all of the admin, all of the other stuff that they're doing relating to the core functions of the organization. Our 3/4 in the last census period have also seen population decline. And, this is very significant in the context of what it is they have to work with. The population decline translates into circumstances of less revenue, of course, in terms of tax income. And I don't know if anybody can believe that things are getting less expensive these days. So, we're kind of stuck in a bit of a catch-22 when we have to look at what basically have been, rising service level expectations, increasing regulatory demands on municipal governments, the kinds of challenges that we see coming out of climate change projections are one more layer that is being applied on top of everything else. And as Kelly notes, we have a lot of strength in our small communities to work with. People know which culvert is about to overflow. They know where to watch out for things going awry. But even those means and local knowledge are being stretched, at this stage in the game.
Right on. Well, Joe, getting deeper into the infrastructure issue, and as an engineer, how do communities need to respond differently now than in the past, would you say?
Well, with respect to engineering in particular, of course, the engineers have a really important role to play in order to do or allow the municipalities, communities to do what they need to do. So as kind of building on what I was saying before with this gap, and I see a gap between technical expertise in engineering, what they're bringing to the table, and then what the community members and decision makers understand about the problems, the solutions, in particular about uncertainty with climate projections and how to deal with it. And I think, both ends, and, again, engineers and communities need to kind of get into this more common space where, as I mentioned earlier, the methods that engineers use become more standardized, and too often solutions are imposed onto communities in terms of infrastructure design that don't necessarily fit or are not the best solutions. And so the engineers need to engage with local folks who live with the infrastructure and would suffer the consequences of failure in order to find ways that work. And communities need to come and understand a little bit more about how engineers do their work and see that there are other solutions. As an example, if a simple example of replacing a culvert, which or a small bridge, or where water is going underneath your road, which we see a lot of washouts during these extreme events that cut off roads. Sometimes just putting in a bigger culvert, it's not the solution. You can make nature-based other solutions, small scale, cheaper solutions upstream that lowers that flow and reduces that risk. And understanding that and having communities work more closely with engineers in this process from a system perspective, I think would be where we really need to go. And I'll take this opportunity to say that the project I've been working on, funded through Natural Resources Canada, which is building regional adaptive capacity and expertise, which this is our fourth year. We've mostly been training engineers on use of data and methods of climate change to incorporate climate change. We're going to be going out kind of on the road to meet with communities and talk about these very things to get folks engaged. And Kathleen's going to be a big part of that MNL, and we have a pretty good contingent going with that. So,
right on. Well, Kelly, you've done a lot of work on collaboration amongst communities and by communities with industry, and some of the work Joe is describing there, the university playing a role. How do you see that type of collaboration playing into finding solutions going forward?
Well, I think it's critical, and small and large communities, because different data and expertise comes from different places. It's particularly important probably for communities that don't have professional staff in a number of areas. Engineers is one great example. Other sort of professional groups are the planning association, professional planners. Certainly that this is important for economic development officials. So I think working with those kinds of professional organizations and service providers to ensure that they're considering climate change impacts and adaptation options and mitigation options for that matter in their work, and bringing that expertise into community planning of various kinds. Because one of the things that you hear come up repeatedly is that with the limited capacity, adding climate change on as yet another responsibility doesn't work for communities that are already stretched. But bringing it into existing processes such as asset management and infrastructure planning, economic development planning, community planning, that then it's integrated in or mainstreamed, if you will, into other planning processes, which is really important. So that I do think the professional organizations can help there. Nonprofits such as Grossmoor and Cooperating Association, for example, is a group that we've worked with in the Grossmoor area, who works with all the communities in their region. They've been looking at tourism planning, for example, and thinking about growth pressure, infrastructure and growth pressures associated with tourism development, but then also where does climate change come in there, and what should we be considering as that kind of growth occurs. So that's a nonprofit organization and a regional approach with multiple communities working together in the region, and they recognize that every community faces its own specific issues around specific infrastructure projects or areas that might be at risk, but that there's a lot of commonalities there that makes sense to speak regionally as well. Indigenous organizations that also have done great work across the country and in our province around climate change impacts and understanding impacts and adapting. So in the West Coast here, the Hallelujah First Nation, for example, has had a climate change program working with a number of communities. Environmental NGOs have been partners for communities. And then, of course, the university, better not forget them, us. So we've done everything from be involved in creating these guidebooks and resources to working with communities, particularly, say, graduate students working to work through the specifics and understanding what's happening in specific communities, using some of those resources like the guidebooks. And we have an initiative now, again, in Grossmoor, and working with support from the Office of Public Engagement to bring students and researchers from Grenfell together with community groups and leaders in Grossmoor, and to better understand the challenges and create adaptation solutions. So collaboration is critical, and there's lots of aspects to it, I guess.
Thanks, Kelly. Well, Kathleen, talk of collaboration, and Kelly talked about some regional approaches there. Regionalization is much on the policy agenda in our province now. How do you see that impacting communities' ability to respond on all this?
Well, hopefully it's going to improve capacity overall. That's really what the whole exercise is founded on. We've got sort of have and have not communities really in many regards right now. Having a relationship, for instance, with outside consultants is a very different one than having your own professional staff. So scenarios under regionalization that might mean that groups of small communities could actually share an engineer means not only that they can make better use of other professionals, who they have engagements with, because they've got that sort of expertise in their back pocket, but they're also going to have somebody that's more familiar, in the same fashion that our public works superintendents are, with the things that tend to go wrong, the things that are reaching the end of their useful life. And that's Kelly was referring to a lot of the sort of the data needs that communities have right now, both in terms of what it is you're having to work with in order to manage and anticipate change, but what it is you need to be collecting. And our big push for the last number of years under the current gas tax agreement is asset management. And asset management is an entirely evidence-based decision-making exercise that is heavily data dependent. That dependency on knowing exactly what proportion of the pipes in your community are relatively recently installed, probably good to go for another 10 years, versus the ones that probably if you don't get to them in the next year or so, you're going to have a fire to put out. And that sort of reactive engagement with our infrastructure is something that, you know, communities in this province know only too well. This time of year, it's usually high season for, you know, pipes bursting and all manner of stuff going awry in this particular department. So, you know, our opportunities under a regionalized system would mean that there are a lot of value adds that we'll have. I mean, we've been doing other work, for instance, around wastewater system effluent regulations. You know, we have a ongoing need to be able to monitor wastewaters at outfalls. We have a lot of drinking water issues that would be assisted tremendously by regional water operators. We have larger community energy, public transportation, and watershed management opportunities that exist in a regional scope that you know, we can't even really touch right now, you know, because we don't have an organizing principle for a lot of those conversations to happen within. So, you know, and of course, you know, as Joe was saying, you know, having sustained relationships with engineers, with land use planners, with some of the other professional staff that are out there that are not sort of one-off contractual engagements that, you know, frankly exist in a very different space, you know, because the revenues that come in a contractual relationship, frankly, are, you know, sort of percentages of the scale of the work. So, you know, these conversations that we have around right sizing, kind of difficult to you know, guarantee in contexts where you've got those sorts of, you know, pricing, tendering, competitive forces, you know, in the marketplace happening as well.
Well, I see one question posted there. And so folks, if you have any thoughts or questions you want to pose to the panel, please go to the Q&A and you can enter questions or ideas in the chat as well. But maybe before we transition to that, I'll throw one more, kind of digging into a lot of what we've talked about so far. But, you know, there's a lot of variety across the province in types of communities. And so, you know, we have the larger urban in the St. John's region, Northeast Avalon, but then you have suburbs that reach out quite a ways these days with people driving and some of the ways that they interact. Then there's rural, then there's remote. And of course, Labrador with northern. And so there's a whole lot of variety there. Anybody want to dig into that in terms of some of the responses you're seeing, some of what's working and some of the challenges remaining? Anyone want to go first on that one? I'll pick on Kelly. I know she's done work in this area.
Well, I guess just to say that the variety, that appreciating that variety of circumstances is really important. And I think everyone has kind of touched on that in terms of not avoiding the one size fits all and understanding that, well, there's this kind of suite of issues that are occurring that affect many communities. Each community is being affected differently by climate change, and their you know, their cultures and ways of life and economies are different, and their infrastructure is different. So we do need to be able to have very flexible programs and supports to help communities where they are, I guess. Mm-hmm. So that would be one thing I would say. And recognize again this point about the resources that people have are different at their disposal, and that might include geographically as well. Because if you're close to Corner Brook or St. John's, you're closer to some of the academic resources, for example, or the government agencies, and it can be even more challenging for people who are, you know, despite the, you know, everyone being online during COVID, the reality still exists that it can be harder for some to access resources that are available. So I think keeping that in mind and being prepared to offer the right kind of supports and the right format of information, and keeping minds open to different kinds of options that might be appropriate for particular places facing particular challenges. That would be, I think, the main point.
Thanks, Kelly. Joe, anything you want to add to this one?
Sure. I would say, some of the technical issues and impacts are different in these different types of areas. In different, even in regions, if you have to do infrastructure design in a more urban area, you're much more limited in the kind of solutions you can use in those areas, because you can only can't control. There's less land available. There's a lot more diversity in terms of property ownership, et cetera. But also, another issue is the impacts of climate change are different in some areas. We've got several different climate zones on the island alone, not to mention Labrador, and also the proximity to the coast and elevation. So one of the biggest issue that the province faces is sea level rise, quite frankly, and coastal impacts and coastal erosion are going to be probably the most impactful, especially in the longer term, as opposed to some of the more, flooding issues and even smaller scale flooding issues. And even that differs from across regions and depending on geography. So those come into the technical aspects of solutions that are, of course, tied in with all the other things as well. So.
Right on. I do see some more questions coming in there. So maybe Kathleen, you want to close off this part of our panel and we'll go to the Q&A.
Yeah, well, maybe just picking up on what Joe's saying, of course, most of our communities are coastal communities. So a lot of the infrastructure that is already in place are the things that, eroding coastlines and flooding is encroaching on. So when we combine that with the sort of thought processes that go alongside of contemporary asset management practice, there are sort of larger questions too that start being introduced about what it is we actually put back in conjunction with, say, population change. We are seeing the impacts of rural to urban migration increasingly in this province. That factor means that in many instances, what may need to be replaced over the next period of time may not necessarily even be the same type of infrastructure. We really need to be looking a lot more so at a wider array of infrastructure solutions as part and parcel of this process, that will actually speak to other types of transformation that may be happening in the community at the same time. We're looking right now at electrification as well. So, all of those sort of larger vectors of change that are being visited upon exactly what the infrastructure is that we use, how we use it, and what the services are, and what the level of service that is actually going to be delivered is going to be. That's a big conversation that is certainly a part of what it is we're looking at having right now.
Great. Well, thanks, Kathleen and panel. Kathy, I see a couple of questions there, and you may see some I haven't seen. Any you want to begin with there?
Sure. Well, we have the first question that came in there is about the core science building. So it's a little bit out of scope from the expertise with you guys, but I think that there's something we can talk about as it relates to communities. So I'll read the question, then I'll add an addendum to the question. MUN should be a model for climate change. Prior to the construction of the new science building, using concrete and steel was a huge carbon footprint taken into consideration. If not, why? And in a province where an abundance of mass timber with such an excellent natural renewable resource, why would we continue to build such buildings? So I know none of you guys were involved in the decision-making around the core science building, but I think it raises an interesting point. And how can communities really balance that infrastructure decision-making when sometimes the choices that can be more climate friendly might be more expensive or unknown, or even just require innovation that's either outside of a given skill set or maybe just not top of mind?
Thanks, Kathy. I think I'll go to Joe first on this one. Any thoughts on the few aspects of that question?
Well, that's hard. It's a hard one to answer, and it's it's also could be a sensitive topic to talk about, right? I don't have a specific answer for that. I can say that I think, again, with engineering in general, when you're doing any kind of construction design, whatever, you're dealing with the inertia of how things are done, right? So you're dealing with the standards, and this is how it's done, and this is how the building's done. My understanding is there was an opportunity to have the building to be sustainable, LEED certified, which is regarding the sustainability, kind of the greenness of the building, which was turned down, and I don't have an answer as to why or why it wouldn't be pursued. Might be more policy related. Certainly money, costs comes into impact. So effect. So I would say that it's in a lot of ways it's no different than anything else in how things work, and they're just going to be done the way that we've done them. Is how it's done is what we're going to do. Where the initiative comes in to change that, I don't. I mean, as engineers, we can do that. As community members can demand some change, I suppose. But yeah, it's hard to say.
Thanks, Joe. Kelly or Kathleen want to weigh in on this one? We do have other questions waiting, so don't feel obliged. But if you want to.
Just to say, I agree with the point that MUN should be looking to be a model for climate responsible behaviors and construction. And I can't speak to the specifics of this building, but it's something we should. And I know there is a group actually that's been working. I'm trying to remember the name of it at Memorial to beyond the ForecastNL, but looking at climate action at Memorial, and certainly infrastructure should be part of that.
And there is, I know, maybe what you're referring to, Kelly, there is a sustainability office at Memorial.
Yes. Yeah.
And of course, Memorial announced a week or so ago about the significant investment, federal and provincial, in boilers being converted to electricity, which took in the thousands equivalent of GHG emissions of cars, but never-ending opportunities and challenges. Kathleen, anything to add to that one?
Only to sort of move it, to the side and basically say all of our major public institutions need to be models, basically. I mean, when we look at it from a local government perspective, yes, we're limited in our capacity, but, there's a whole process of transformation that is kind of one that has to be led by a number of the better resourced organizations in our midst, particularly, of course, educational institutions where they're, kind of providing a context for the next generation of workers that are also going to be heading out there and, replicating and improving things, we hope. From a municipal standpoint, there are a lot of things that we'd like to do differently, and that through procurement decisions and through tendering practices, communities definitely are empowered now to make better decisions and to be able to err in favor of greener practices and more sustainable infrastructure. So a lot of opportunity alongside of the sorts of challenges that we face making it real.
Thanks, Kathleen. Kathy, other questions ready to go there?
Oh, we have lots. And I just wanted to remind people too, if you're posting questions in the chat, that's fine, especially to encourage participation amongst other viewers. But if you want the question to be posed to the panel, pop your question in the Q&A box as well, just so I know that it's a question for the panel and not just an open question for other participants. So we do have a question there about vulnerability assessments. Is there any initiative to conduct vulnerability assessments on a regional scale? In other words, given many individual communities do not have the resources, pooling resources with federal, provincial support to first identify any major vulnerabilities for each region and priorities for addressing them.
Thank you. Who'd like to go on that one? Joe.
Yeah, I can say that with regional vulnerability assessments are a good idea, but there's also a lot of variation even within regions as to what what's, vulnerable. I've done some of the projects I'm working on where we do some of the vulnerability assessments. And I do it. My work's mostly got to do with stormwater, and so we do watersheds. And so we look at watersheds, and really for that kind of work, you can only do one watershed at a time. So there's limits to regional type of vulnerability. With that, I mean, depending on what you're looking at. So.
Interesting. And when you think of watersheds, normally I have no expertise, but it's often a pretty broad area, I would think. But the particular communities impacted are quite localized. So it's almost a think regional, act local, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the advantage of regional, like from a watershed perspective with regional, we need to have for precipitation, rainfall is important. That can be done regionally, but the impacts are watershed based.
Right.
I think that's, if I could just jump in, that's kind of the best situation with regional efforts, that you recognize, that you recognize the diversity within the region, and you can work at that local scale, but within the kind of regional frame, recognizing that there's some commonalities in terms of what, change in precipitation, and also some of the dynamics, whether they're cultural, economic dynamics that are similar. And so that relates to the Grossmore example that I had used. Of course, it's a, tourism development region, there's fisheries. So there's common things to talk about, but also very specific issues that need to be discussed community by community. And I think a regional effort is best done recognizing that and building from the bottom up, but to the regional scale. I think, Kathleen, didn't the Northeast Avalon, other than Grossmore, I'm thinking, wasn't there a Northeast Avalon initiative at some point as well?
Consumption Bay North. Okay. We had a cluster of communities there, but they were actually, and this nice segue, thank you for that, was an exercise in asset management. In fact, this group of communities got together to work on getting their asset management plan done. And they were working at the time with Conservation Corps resourcing. And they, in fact, were using some of the resources that we've had, like the good old 7 Steps toolkit, which was really founded on the notion that we needed to have community scale conversations and pull local experience and awareness of change out as part of the process. So but the exercise of asset management has a whole component that is about assessing risk. It's about identifying vulnerabilities and being able to anticipate and plan for them. And alongside of all of the resources that we have that are geared for climate change adaptation right now are the portals for climate data and services that Environment and Climate Change Canada, through the climate services section, have ensured have been set up across the country. So the Atlantic region now has Climate Atlantic up and running, not even a year at this stage in the game, but a lot of the sort of downscaled climate information and resources that formerly, I guess, were residing on the provincial government website. There's a lot more detail and resource that is available through that portal as well. That can be accessed if you've got some of those resource people who are going to help facilitate the process. And that's really the regional piece in this. For the most part, these are conversations, yes, that need to be very granular. They need to happen at a local level, but the chances are that there are certain parts of that process that could be done by clusters of communities. There are, going to be a number of commonalities between, say, a group of municipalities that share a coastline and have sort of a similar experience of erosion and flooding, for instance. So that type of clustering and regional adaptation effort and facilitation, I think, is very much a part of what we're going to see a lot more of. I think back when Kelly and I were working on the toolkit, I think that idea was there as well, that, there would be opportunities to sort of go in and, do an area at a time and work with neighboring municipalities and perhaps bring them together to sort of share knowledge and approach, because in many instances, a lot of their emergency response capacity is also shared, and at the time, I remember we were having a lot of conversations around, what that might mean if, say, this town was cut off, or this portion of the community and their fire department was cut off. Was there a way that they could have resources come from elsewhere? So all of these things are sort of pushing us to places where I guess we just see the value in these regional approaches time and time again.
Thank you, panel. Very constructive, proactive stuff there. Kathy, next question.
Sure. Part of the problem I see here, not me, but the person asking the question, obviously, part of the problem I see here is the lack of information strategies to help the climate change narrative on a community by community basis. As a result, there is a reactive as opposed to a proactive approach to the challenges and problems climate change presents. The new culverts example. What sorts of broader information strategies should be adopted to build these often quite local narratives?
I think I saw Kathleen ready to go on that one.
Yeah, well, I can't not, because I feel like my entire life, the last several years, has been all about asset management, and this is part of, the embeddedness that we get at with the asset management approaches that are being taken. Those narratives that might formerly have been happening in their own little space are now actually going to be embedded in budgetary processes, because they're incorporated at the level of the risk assessment that you're undertaking, alongside of which pieces of infrastructure are perhaps nearing the end of their useful life and represent an opportunity for either replacement or some type of other intervention in order to extend their useful life. Those are going to be ongoing conversations, and I think reflecting on the power of certain practices to really be a part of the transformation that we need to have. Our issues have largely existed because there have been always these bigger fish to fry, and these conversations somehow have happened in a different space from the one that is actually making the decision about what the infrastructure investment is going to be and when it's going to happen and what it's going to look like. We're seeing much more integration by virtue of some of these evidence-based approaches that we're moving towards.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. Joe or Kelly, want to add to that one?
Well, just to add that I think the work that municipalities Newfoundland and Labrador has done has been critical in this, because when we started doing this toolkit work, I remember Kathleen presenting at M&L and people saying, I don't really know how this affects me, or we've got enough on our plate. I don't think, and you would know better from being more, inside the organization, but that you're not hearing that same kind of 10 years later, you're not hearing that, thankfully, not hearing quite so much of that, I don't think, and so there's an awareness building process and information sharing process that's been really critical, I think, to get to help municipal leaders at the community level think about how these things affect them. But also, interesting question, Ron, about even it does the awareness and the change has to happen at the local level. So even like schools, I don't know to what extent this is being integrated into school curricula or not, but it seems to me there are lots of opportunities at the local level to increase the dialogue and look at how communities are being impacted. But also then I would hope to share those lessons across communities, and that addresses your point about the proactive approach and not having the one size fits all thing. If we had, I know one thing we did with the National Assessment Chapter is make a map across Canada of adaptation case studies. Maybe we could do more with that in Newfoundland and Labrador about sharing what our community is doing to adapt, or with making available kind of a range of examples of what people are doing in response to different kinds of challenges, because even though these are very local situations, there's also a range of different things that people are doing. And I think that was another question here. about what people have been doing. But and I think, you know, people get ideas for their own local context from what others have done. So I think, yeah, more local, maybe awareness and sharing, discussion, but also sharing examples across communities. And I think those are things we just need to keep working at.
Great. And Joe, anything different to add?
Well, not different so much as well, more focused in some ways, because some of the work that I'm doing and what I want to move forward with, some of the workshops that I mentioned is looking at, you know, specifically focusing on the watershed scale, where you know, as an example, when we look at climate change projections, they do the emission scenarios. So what are the cases? What are the possible cases? So one of the ways that I think would be useful, you know, is through, you know, developing alternative scenarios for how to manage stormwater with the community, because it would enhance this learning and communication to see that you can solve these problems. There's not, you know, in a way that's unique to your community, but with existing resources or existing techniques that would engage, you know, community members and engineers and planners all at once. And it'll be a matter of, it's really kind of a form of storytelling. It's like, what future would you like? You know, I know, and it's kind of idealistic now as I think of it, but I think it's something to work towards, where you make folks very much aware of how you make a change upstream that's going to impact what happens lower down, you know, and you know, it's going to affect your neighbors or things like that. So, and that's a way, I think, to have that conversation and you know, again, get people to see how this is going to affect me and the folks around me.
Super. Okay, Kathy, next question.
Okay, this is the last question we have in the Q&A. I know that there's lots coming in through the chat, so just pop me a message or pop it in the Q&A if you want me to ask it to the panel. So this is about wind. So what about wind? There is data recently released suggesting that we are experiencing an increasing number and intensity of wind events, and yet I don't hear much talk about this as a risk that needs closer attention in the context of infrastructure systems. Any thoughts?
Thanks, Kathy, and whoever posed that question. I will guarantee there's more wind, and it's always on the weekend. So I'd love some research on that. Who would like to weigh in on that one first?
If I may, I think I saw the report. I think the interview was with Joel Finnis, who's a climate scientist here at MUN, and I've talked to Joel about this. One of the things to bear in mind when he in that piece is that he indicates that long term there's really doesn't seem to be much of a visible trend in the data of wind. However, in the short term, there's variation in the winds. So that said, again, I'm not a climate scientist, but in my understanding is that we just don't know yet. You know, there's not a lot of good information, and so much of it is anecdotal, you know, about experiences. And it's not to say that's not true, but it's hard to verify. And in addition, the climate models don't do surface winds very well because they're larger scale, and surface winds are very much dependent on surface features, the connection with the ocean, the local geography, the local you know, topography and things like that. That impacts winds quite a bit, and the models are don't do really well on that. So it's difficult. There's a lot of people wanting to get more information, and I think it's an area where there's ongoing research, and it's difficult to say. Again, don't intend to speak for Joel Finnis at all, but this is my understanding.
Joel is a member of our ForecastNL steering committee. Maybe Joe, and I'll come back to Kelly and Kathleen on this one too, if they want. Based on, you know, hypothetically, then, if we did see increased wind and variation, what are the most obvious impacts? I mean, most of us can kind of guess, but from your perspective, the impacts on communities.
You know, I don't know. Honestly, you know, I mean, it goes into structures, this design of structures, but I really don't know, to tell you the honest.
Right. Kathleen, from your work, anything come up there?
Well, a few things. These higher energy storms, and particularly wind systems, in the offshore, are basically driving the fetch, the wave action that actually is the mechanical feature of the erosive energies that we see acting on our coasts. That is one of the big impacts. So we could see an acceleration, for instance, of erosion rates on certain coastlines under those circumstances. So, wind is significant there in terms of, so that of course impacts potentially a whole host of the coastal infrastructure that we've been talking about before. I know I studied with Dr. Norm Caddo, who I imagine many in the audience have heard speak to climate change impacts, in years past. But the features, the prevailing wind in a given storm can mean that you're seeing a different sort of drainage pattern on the landscape, and certain areas of town, for instance, that will see a lot more of the impact from the high drainage activity and potential flooding. Of course, our utility systems. We have a lot of our electric systems are basically still, we haven't dug many of them in because, of course, we live on the rock, and it's not as easy to bury these systems in much of our province. So, Newfoundland Hydro and Newfoundland Power have done a lot of work, basically consolidating our electric infrastructure in the face of high windstorm impacts, and yes, there are going to be other impacts, I'm sure, on buildings and other infrastructure, but those are probably the big ones as I understand it from the wind perspective.
Thanks, Kathleen. Kelly, anything you'd want to add on this one?
Trouble with my mute there. No, I think I'll leave it at that. Lots of great stuff there. And Tony Keats is commenting too that they have seen wind as one of the largest impacts on their shoreline, which is taking a massive pounding on outfalls and roads. So
right on.
Yeah.
And we are almost out of time. Kathy, I don't know if we have time for another question, but is there a short snapper we could do?
There are no more questions in the Q&A. So I don't know if people just want to do a summary of their own short snappers.
Right on. Well, I'm going to go real quick. Joe, any last thoughts, recommendations for communities going forward?
For communities, I can say relevant to communities. I would say engineers, I think, need to come and recognize that we don't have all the answers, and we need to engage with local communities to find solutions that fit for everyone, and communities should expect that more, I think.
Super. Kathleen? Oh, you're muted there.
Classic. Communities in Newfoundland and Labrador, continue to, look forward to working with, students that are in a lot of the programs that both Joe and Kelly are involved in. And I know M&L is really interested in helping to secure work term opportunities for a lot of the folks that are available to help with things like vulnerability assessments, condition assessments of infrastructure, documenting and getting asset management practices up and running in communities. And also because, of course, the next generation of the labor force that are going to be supporting community development, community governance, regional governance, they're in school right now. And there are opportunities to give them some really, really good experiential education right now, just helping us get over the threshold of a lot of these new practices and evidence-based approaches that we need in order to be able to better function and ensure sustainable communities in the long run.
Right on. And Kelly, final words for you.
I would say just continue to think about climate change and its implications in all that you do. Kind of try to integrate it into your work versus seeing it as something separate or add-on, and reach out. I think that just speaks to what everyone has said here. You know, we're here, M&L, various levels of governments have programs, the universities. So yeah, we're here to work with communities as best we all can. So
Wonderful. Thanks, panel, for a great job, and lots of great chat and dialogue in the chat. And all that can continue online at our ForecastNL website with our Citizens Forum, with our steering committee experts, and with our panel today. Kathy and Mandy will keep in touch with the panel. If there are particular questions or points that come up, we'll connect and you can join directly. Everybody's welcome to go there for the ongoing dialogue on these really important issues around climate, economy, and society. This session is recorded, and so you can certainly go back and reuse it and learn from this session. Thanks to Kathy and our team at the Harris Center for the pulling the session together. And of course, thank you for attending online and viewing the recorded version later. We look forward to hearing from you, and we'll see you at our next session. Thanks a million, and take care.